So in a previous video, we were investigating a problem with the search for different length counter strings. And as we were doing that, I noticed that at some resolutions, there's a search button and the search button didn't appear to do anything. Because I found that when I was testing another problem. The one thing you have to keep in mind when you're doing exploratory testing is to stay on focus. So if you're doing session-based type testing and you've written a charter in advance, then you might view that as off charter because we're looking at the counter string and why counter string isn't working. We're not looking at the search button. So during our exploratory testing, we make notes of questions, defects, ideas, things we want to look at in the future. This would be one of the things we want to look at in the future so that we can come back to it later. We can prioritize it in terms of, is this something we want to look at now in comparison to all the other things we've got to do. But what we don't want to do is get distracted. So now I'm starting a new session or a new phase of testing or a new time-boxed period for exploration where I'm going to look at the search button. So the problem we've got here is if I do test, I click search, it doesn't search. Now one of the interesting things here for me is I noticed that because I had the developer toolbar up, which meant that the screen size was smaller than normal. So this search button only appears at certain resolutions. So what we've got here is a responsive site. So there it is at, what's the breakpoint for that? 1010 it looks like, 11. So if it's less than 1012, then it comes true. So there's probably CSS covering that. I could look at the CSS and see exactly what the value is. And then at a certain point in time, the search button goes away again. So that's interesting for me because there's a number of possibilities that could happen at that point. Now we have to decide when we're testing, do we speculate on the reason why certain things happened? That's a useful thing to do after the fact, when you're looking at root cause as to how do we make sure that these type of problems never occur again. Then you start looking at how did this happen. Now it's entirely possible that at some point a range of devices dropped out of the testing of GitHub, so that problem was no longer visible. Because if I go into device mode, let's go into device mode. There we are. Let me move this out. If I go into device mode, we can see on the iPad, the original iPad's search button is there. I checked on my tablet, which isn't a super new tablet, search button is there. If I look at the iPhone X, there's no search button. iPad Pro, let's do iPad Pro, no search button. No search button. No search button. Right, so a lot of the mobile devices that are in the responsive mode don't have that because they've got different resolutions. So perhaps the resolution dropped out. However, we don't have to concern ourselves with why. What we're concerning ourselves with is what is causing this to not work. Is this a problem with it cross-browser? So one of the things I look for with cross-browser is JavaScript errors. Perhaps this isn't working because of JavaScript errors. So I go into console, I don't see any JavaScript errors there. So what I'm interested in now is, all right, well, what is this button doing? So I'm going to inspect it. I can see it's a button and it's a submit button. So because it's a type submit, if it's in a form, it will just submit that form. So where is the form that this is associated with? So here's a before class. That is wrapping the input. So I'm not sure where the form is. Let's have a look at the input button, and not the input button, the input field. And there we go. So we've got the input field, it's ARIA labeled, so it's designed for accessibility. And we've got the form there. And the button is not part of the form. So that's an issue, right? Because that button is never going to submit that form because it's not part of the form. So what I'm interested then is, well, what happens if I just do something as simple as take this button and drag it into the form? Right, because it's the DOM on our page. We have control over this. So now we can see that as soon as the button's in there, we actually have a kind of responsive layout issue, right? Because the button is underneath the field. So perhaps, again, that's making me think, well, perhaps that's just not tested and it's not looked at because it hasn't been styled for that. So let's try, I'm going to test form, click search, and now it works. So the root cause of this problem is that the search button itself is not actually in the form that it's part of. There doesn't really seem to be any JavaScript around this to make it submit the form that it's not part of, and because it's happening on a purely limited set of sizes, it may have been forgotten. But what we've got here now is the ability to report it in terms of, well, during this particular range of resolutions, the search button is enabled, and we know that the search button, when you click it, doesn't submit the form because it's not part of the form. So should it be? Should the search button still be there? What's happening? Right, so I found that, I mean, it's an interesting little defect, but it also represents when you're doing exploratory testing, you shouldn't get distracted and follow every single path because it's way too easy to get off track. What we need to get in the habit of doing when we're doing exploratory testing is keeping good notes about what we're focused on, what our actual intent for this set of tests is, what questions we were looking for answers, what experiments we're trying to do. Keep track of the ideas, right, but don't follow them yet, because every idea has to be prioritized and put into focus so that we know that it's important enough to look at. So just a quick example of that using GitHub on live, where the search button doesn't work.